The smell of burnt paper and caramelized ozone was a scent Izuku Midoriya knew intimately. It was the scent of his own ruined aspirations. It drifted through the stifling air of the Aldera Junior High classroom, sharp and acrid, lingering long after the final bell had rung. The classroom was empty now, save for Izuku. He sat frozen at his desk, his eyes locked on the space where his notebook had been just moments before. Hero Analysis for the Future, number 13. It was gone. Tossed out the third-story window by a hand that crackled with miniature, devastating explosions. Katsuki Bakugo's words still echoed in the oppressive silence of the room, heavy and suffocating. If you want to be a hero that badly, there's a quick way to do it. Believe that you'll be born with a quirk in your next life, and take a swan dive off the roof. Izuku's breath hitched, the sound loud in the empty room. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. The fabric of his uniform trousers wrinkled beneath his white-knuckled grip. He didn't cry. Not yet. He had long ago learned that crying in front of Bakugo only invited more pain, and even now, with his childhood friend gone, the phantom weight of Bakugo's crimson glare kept the tears at bay. Slowly, shakily, Izuku stood up. He slung his faded yellow backpack over his shoulder. The strap dug into a fresh bruise near his collarbone, but he ignored it. He had a notebook to retrieve. The walk down the stairs and out to the school's courtyard felt like a death march. The late afternoon sun cast long, mocking shadows across the concrete. Izuku found the notebook in the small, decorative koi pond near the building's foundation. It was floating face down, the edges charred black, the pages soaking up the murky green water. A particularly bold koi fish was nibbling at the corner, trying to make a meal of Izuku's meticulous handwriting. "That's not fish food," Izuku whispered, his voice trembling. He knelt by the pond and gently pulled the notebook from the water. It was ruined. The cover, once proudly bearing its title in bold marker, was now a smudged, illegible mess. Water dripped from the sodden pages, washing away hours of painstaking analysis, sketches, and tactical breakdowns of local heroes. He held the wet mass to his chest, regardless of the water seeping into his uniform. It was just a notebook to anyone else. To Bakugo, it was a pathetic delusion. To the teachers, it was a distraction. But to Izuku, it was a lifeline. It was the only proof that he belonged in a world populated by gods and monsters. He didn't have superhuman strength, he couldn't create fire or manipulate gravity. He had a double joint in his pinky toe and a mind that wouldn't stop racing. As he walked out of the school gates, the familiar weight of reality settled onto his shoulders. He was quirkless. A relic of human evolution. A stepping stone for those destined for greatness. Izuku needed a distraction. The silence in his head was too loud, filled with Bakugo's cruel laughter and his own crushing self-doubt. He couldn't go home yet. His mother would see the state of his uniform, the raw look in his eyes, and she would look at him with that heartbreaking, pitying expression. "I'm sorry, Izuku. I'm so sorry." He couldn't handle that today. Instead, he altered his route, heading toward the bustling commercial district of Mizurufu. The streets were crowded, a vibrant tapestry of society. People with horns, colorful scales, and floating hair hurried past him. Izuku ducked his head, navigating the sea of quirks with practiced ease, feeling entirely invisible. He found a small, cramped convenience store and slipped inside, the chime of the door announcing his arrival. He bypassed the snacks and drinks, heading straight for the stationery aisle. His eyes scanned the shelves until he found them, the cheap, 100 yen, thread-bound notebooks. He grabbed one with a plain, unbranded blue cover. It wasn't the high-quality paper he preferred for his sketches, but it would have to do. After paying the bored cashier, Izuku stepped back out onto the street. The sky above had darkened, ominous gray clouds rolling in from the coast, threatening rain. Izuku barely noticed. He pulled a pen from his pocket, flipped the cheap notebook open to the first page, and began to walk. He needed to write. He needed to ground himself. Hero Analysis for the Future, number 14. He wrote the title at the top of the page. The scratching of the ballpoint pen against the paper was incredibly soothing. His mind immediately jumped to the villain fight he had witnessed that morning on his way to school involving Kamui Woods and Empty Lady. Kamui Woods, Izuku wrote, his hand flying across the page as he walked blindly down the sidewalk. Arbor quirk. Highly effective for capture and restraint. However, heavy reliance on environmental anchoring. His lacquered chain prison requires a solid footing to generate the necessary leverage to restrain a struggling target of greater mass. Izuku chewed on his lower lip, his eyes glued to the paper, completely oblivious to the pedestrian traffic around him. If an opponent possesses thermal capabilities, Wood is naturally disadvantaged. However, Camui's primary weakness isn't fire, it's mobility under stress. His joints stiffen when expanding his wood rapidly. If he incorporated a fire-retardant mesh into his hero costume, or utilized a specialized coating on his bark, perhaps a synthetic hydrogel spray, he could buy himself the necessary 4.5 seconds to close the distance against a fire user before structural damage occurs. Furthermore, his center of gravity shifts too far forward when lunging. Izuku was so deep in his tactical trance that he didn't see the man stepping out of the high-end coffee shop directly into his path. He didn't see the impeccably tailored gray suit. He didn't see the sharp, calculating yellow eyes behind rectangular glasses. Izuku walked face first into what felt like a solid wall of iron. Oof! Izuku yelped, rebounding off the figure. The cheap notebook slipped from his grasp, fluttering to the pavement, as Izuku lost his footing and landed hard on his backside. His yellow backpack spilled onto the concrete, the ruined, waterlogged remnants of Notebook 13 sliding out of the unzipped pocket. "Watch where you are going," a cold, sharp voice commanded. Izuku scrambled back, his eyes darting up in sheer panic. The man towering over him was tall and unnervingly rigid. His posture was so perfect it looked painful. He had dark green hair peppered with golden blonde streaks, swept back perfectly. His face was a mask of severe displeasure, his piercing yellow eyes looking down at Izuku as if the boy were a particularly uninteresting insect that had wandered into his path. "I am so sorry," Izuku stammered, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was already having the worst day of his life. Now he had bumped into a businessman who looked like he could snap Izuku in half with his bare hands. "I wasn't looking, I was distracted. I'm really sorry." The man did not blink. He adjusted his glasses with a single, gloved finger. Situational awareness is the foundation of self-preservation. Walking blindly in a crowded thoroughfare is not only foolish, it is a liability to others. The words were spoken with a clipped, precise cadence. They weren't yelled, but the absolute authority in them made Izuku flinch harder than he did at Bakugo's explosions. "Why, yes, sir." "I'm sorry," Izuku squeaked, hurriedly gathering his things. He grabbed the charred, wet remains of Notebook 13 and shoved it violently into his backpack, his face burning with humiliation. He zipped the bag, scrambled to his feet, and bowed a full 90 degrees. "Please excuse me." Without waiting for a response, Izuku spun on his heel and bolted down the street, disappearing into the crowd of pedestrians, desperate to escape the man's piercing gaze. Sir Nighteye stood motionless on the sidewalk, watching the boy flee. He let out a quiet, measured sigh, annoyed by the disruption. He was amused for tracking a low-level trigger smuggling ring, a tedious assignment that required a meticulous review of financial ledgers and shipping manifests. He had stepped out for exactly 4 minutes to procure a black coffee, only to be assaulted by a muttering middle schooler. He looked down, preparing to resume his walk back to his temporary field office. There, resting on the concrete, was a cheap blue notebook. The boy had dropped it in his frantic escape. Nighteye stared at it. His first instinct was to step over it and continue on his way. He did not have the time or the inclination to act as a lost and found service for a clumsy child. But as he looked at the open page, his highly trained eyes caught a few words written in a frantic, scrawling hand. Specialized coating on his bark, perhaps a synthetic hydrogel spray. He could buy himself the necessary 4.5 seconds to close the distance. Nighteye paused. His brows furrowed slightly behind his glasses. He bent down, his movements precise and controlled, and picked up the notebook. He stood up straight, holding his coffee in one hand and the cheap paper in the other. He began to read the single page the boy had written. For the first 10 seconds, Nighteye's expression remained passive. By the 20th second, his eyes narrowed, scanning the lines of text with increasing speed. By the 30th second, Sir Nighteye, former sidekick to the symbol of peace and one of the most brilliant analytical minds in the hero industry, was utterly captivated. The handwriting was a mess, clearly jotted down while walking, but the contents were staggering. It was an analysis of Shinji Nishiya, the rookie hero Kamui Woods. Nighteye himself had recently reviewed Kamui Woods' combat footage while assessing rising heroes for potential agency partnerships. Nighteye had noted the rookie's over-reliance on environmental anchoring and his predictable center of gravity when executing his ultimate move. It had taken Nighteye, a man with 20 years of experience and an intelligence-gathering quirk, watching 3 separate engagements from multiple angles to isolate those specific biomechanical flaws. This child had written it down on a piece of 100 yen paper as if it were common sense. Nighteye read further down the page. The suggestion of a synthetic hydrogel spray. It was brilliant. Not only would it mitigate the thermal weakness, but hydrogels were lightweight and wouldn't restrict the elasticity of the wood generation. The calculation of 4.5 seconds wasn't a random number, Nighteye realized. It was the exact average time it took a standard low to mid-tier fire quark user to reach combustion temperatures hot enough to instantly ignite dense timber. The boy had calculated thermodynamics, combat pacing, and support gear chemistry, and synthesized it into a single, cohesive tactical adjustment. Nighteye flipped the notebook closed and looked at the cover. Hero Analysis for the Future, number 14. Izuku Midoriya. Nighteye looked up, his yellow eyes scanning the crowded street in the direction the green-haired boy had run. He was long gone. Izuku Midoriya, Nighteye murmured, testing the syllables. The name was unfamiliar. Nighteye tucked the notebook into the breast pocket of his tailored suit. The trigger smuggling ring could wait. A financial ledger was predictable. A mind capable of this level of deductive foresight, wandering around in the head of a middle schooler, was an anomaly. And Sir Nighteye did not ignore anomalies. 3 days later, the rain finally came to Muzidafu. It was a cold, miserable downpour that washed the streets clean and turned the sky a depressing shade of iron. Izuku walked home from Aldera Junior High, holding a clear plastic umbrella over his head. The rain drummed relentlessly against the plastic, matching the dull, rhythmic throbbing of the headache he had nursed all day. The past 3 days had been a blur of misery. Bakugo had been exceptionally cruel, sensing Izuku's heightened depression and exploiting it. The loss of Notebook 13 still stung, but what bothered Izuku more was the loss of Notebook 14. He had searched his bag a dozen times, retraced his steps to the convenience store, and walked the route he had taken, but it was gone. Now he had nothing to write in, and the thoughts were backing up in his head, a chaotic traffic jam of quirks, hero debuts, and tactical theories that had no outlet. Izuku sighed, his breath puffing into a small white cloud in the chilly air. He decided to take the long way home, walking along the seawall near Dagoba Municipal Beach. The beach was a notorious illegal dumping ground, piled high with mountains of rusted refrigerators, old tires, and broken furniture. It was an eyesore, but the sheer scale of the trash offered a strange, isolated quiet. No one came here. As Izuku walked along the concrete path overlooking the trash heaps, a strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck. It was a cold, creeping feeling, like the sudden drop in air pressure before a thunderstorm. He stopped. The sound of the rain hitting the ocean and the garbage was loud, but beneath it, he heard nothing. Slowly Izuku turned his head, peering over his shoulder. The walkway behind him was empty. He swallowed hard, tightening his grip on his umbrella handle, and turned back forward. Standing exactly 10 paces in front of him, blocking the narrow walkway, was the man from the city. Izuku stopped dead in his tracks. His heart performed a violent gymnastics routine in his chest. It was him. The tall, terrifying man in the gray suit. He wasn't holding an umbrella. He simply stood in the downpour, the rain visibly deflecting off an invisible, perfectly tailored raincoat. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture as impossibly rigid as before. Those piercing yellow eyes locked onto Izuku, pinning him in place like a butterfly on a mounting board. "Ah," Izuku stuttered, taking a step backward. His flight response kicked in, screaming at him to turn and run, but his legs felt like lead. Why was this man here? Had Izuku committed a crime? Was he a villain? No, he didn't look like a villain. He looked like an auditor for the Grim Reaper. Izuku Midoriya, the man spoke. His voice cut cleanly through the sound of the rain, carrying an eerie acoustic clarity. Izuku flinched. He knows my name. Why, yes? Izuku squeaked, his voice cracking horribly. The man unclasped his hands. From inside his coat, he produced a small, blue rectangular object. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger. Izuku's breath caught. It was Notebook 14. 3 days ago, you collided with me in the commercial district, the man said, his tone clinical, lacking any warmth or malice. You dropped this in your haste to retreat. I'm sorry, Izuku bowed quickly, water spilling from his umbrella. Thank you for finding it. You didn't have to come all this way just to return it. I did not seek you out to return a piece of cheap stationery, Midoriya, the man replied. He took a slow, measured step forward. I sought you out because of what was written inside it. Izuku froze. His blood ran cold. The man had read it. Of course he read it. He knows my name. Panic flared in Izuku's chest. Had he written something illegal? Was his analysis of Kamui Woods considered unauthorized surveillance of a pro-hero? Was this man a government agent? I am sorry, Izuku blurted out, waving his free hand frantically. It's just a hobby. I just watch the news and the fights and I write down my thoughts. I didn't mean to pry into classified hero weaknesses, I swear. Please don't arrest me. The man stopped. He stared at Izuku, his expression completely unreadable. Then, he reached up and pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. Arrest you? The man let out a sharp, single exhale of air. It wasn't a laugh, but it was close. Do not be absurd. I am not law enforcement. The man reached into his jacket pocket with his free hand, produced a sleek silver business card case, flipped it open with his thumb, and extracted a card. He held it out. Izuku hesitated, then slowly closed the distance, his knees knocking together. He reached out with a trembling hand and took the card. The card stock was thick, the text embossed in sharp, minimalist silver lettering. Sir Nighteye, Pro-Hero Agency Director. Izuku stared at the card. He blinked. He stared again. His brain ground to a halt, then violently restarted, gears spinning out of control. Sir Nighteye? The Sir Nighteye? All Might's former sidekick? The brains behind the golden age of the symbol of peace? The hero with the foresight quirk, capable of seeing the future? The man who vanished from the public eye to run one of the most exclusive and successful underground agencies in the country? SS Sir Nighteye? Izuku shrieked, his umbrella wobbling dangerously. He looked up, his eyes wide and starry, instantly replacing his terror with blinding, obsessive awe. You're Sir Nighteye. Oh my God! I've read all the declassified case files on your agency. Your tactical takedown of the Toxic Chainsaw Gang was a masterpiece of predictive routing. You, quiet, Nighteye commanded. Izuku's mouth snapped shut audibly. Your enthusiasm is abrasive, Nighteye said, though there was a microscopic twitch at the corner of his mouth at the mention of the Toxic Chainsaw case. However, it confirms my hypothesis. You are an obsessive consumer of hero media. But consuming media does not explain this. Nighteye tapped the blue notebook. I have spent the last 3 days conducting a background check on you, Izuku Midoriya. You are 14 years old. You attend Aldera Junior High. Your grades are exceptional, yet your teachers report you as distracted and submissive. You have no criminal record. You have no ties to support gear manufacturers. You have no formal training in combat analytics, biomechanics, or tactical psychology. Nighteye took another step forward, towering over Izuku. The shadow of his imposing frame swallowed the boy. Yet, in a single page, written while walking down a busy street, you accurately diagnosed a structural flaw in a pro-hero's ultimate move, calculated the thermal delay of standard fire quirks, and proposed a chemically sound support gear solution. Nighteye leaned down, his yellow eyes locking onto Izuku's wide green ones. Explain your methodology. Izuku swallowed hard. The absolute intensity radiating from Nighteye was suffocating. He wasn't looking at Izuku like he was a useless kid. He was looking at him like a puzzle that needed solving. I just... Izuku stammered, his mind racing. I watched them. When a hero fights, I look at how they plant their feet. Kamiri Woods relies on his left leg to anchor his root system when he uses the lacquered chain prison. But wood is rigid when it's thick, so the kinetic force of a struggling villain has to go somewhere. It goes to his lower back. If a villain can exploit that axis, his restraint breaks. And for the fire, it's just basic thermodynamics. Most fire quirks take a few seconds to reach the ignition point of dense wood, because the user has to regulate their own body temperature first. Izuku cut himself off, realizing he was rambling. He looked down at his red shoes, deeply embarrassed. It's just obvious stuff. Anyone could see it. It is not obvious stuff, Nighteye countered sharply. It is high-level predictive analysis. It is the type of deduction I require from my senior sidekicks after years of training. Izuku's head snapped up in shock. Did Sir Nighteye just compliment him? Nighteye studied the boy's reaction. The shock, the disbelief. It painted a very clear, very grim picture of the boy's social environment. Whoever this child was, he was entirely unaware of his own brilliance. He had been beaten down, conditioned to believe his intellect was worthless. Tell me, Midoriya, Nighteye asked, his tone softening just a fraction, becoming analytical rather than accusatory. What is your quirk? The world seemed to stop spinning. The rain drumming against the umbrella faded into white noise. Izuku felt the blood drain from his face. His stomach plummeted into an icy abyss. There it was. The question. The ultimate barrier. The wall that stood between him and the rest of the world. Every time he showed a spark of potential, every time he dared to dream, this question arose to crush him back into the dirt. Sir Nighteye was a pro-hero. He valued strength, capability, and power. He was asking what tool Izuku used to process information so quickly. Was it a hyper-intelligence quirk? A minor sensory enhancement? A weak form of clairvoyance? Izuku opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The back of his throat burned. The tears, held back for 3 days since Bakugo had thrown his notebook out the window, finally surged forward. They welled in his eyes, hot and uncontrollable, spilling over his freckled cheeks and mixing with the dampness of the cold air. He clutched the handle of his umbrella with both hands, his knuckles turning white. He looked down at his feet, unable to meet the piercing yellow eyes of the hero standing before him. Izuku choked out, his voice a pathetic, broken whisper. I don't have one. The silence that followed was agonizing. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the inevitable. He waited for Nighteye's face to morph into the familiar expression of pity, or worse, disgust. He waited for the hero to turn around and walk away, dismissing Izuku as a waste of time. A broken toy. A quirkless loser who played pretend in cheap notebooks. Go ahead, Izuku thought, his heart shattering all over again. Tell me to be realistic. Tell me I can't do it. Tell me it's impossible. But the silence stretched on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Izuku forced himself to open his eyes. He slowly raised his head, bracing himself for the rejection. Sir Nighteye had not moved. He had not turned away. His expression had not shifted to pity or disgust. Instead, Nighteye was looking at Izuku with an intensity that burned brighter than before. The sharp angles of his face seemed to soften, just slightly, revealing a profound, calculating reverence. For Sir Nighteye, the boy's tears were not a sign of weakness. They were the final piece of the puzzle. Nighteye possessed the quirk foresight. He could look into the future, seeing the world as a reel of film. He relied on it. It was the absolute truth. But without his quirk, Nighteye was merely a man in a suit, armed with hyperdense stamps and a sharp mind. He knew the limitations of relying solely on a genetic lottery. He knew that true heroism, true capability, was born in the mind, not the blood. He had spent years looking for a successor, someone to groom. He had looked at students with powerful physical quirks, flashy abilities, and overwhelming charisma. But none of them had the mind. None of them could see the battlefield the way he did. And here, standing on a rainy walkway next to a mountain of garbage, was a 14-year-old boy. A boy who had no quirk, no physical enhancements, no biological shortcuts. A boy who had looked at the world of gods and monsters and, purely through the power of human observation, logic, and sheer, obsessive willpower, had artificially replicated the effects of foresight. He did this with his mind alone, Nighteye thought, a rare thrill of genuine excitement pulsing through his veins. A raw, unfiltered, unparalleled mind. He is entirely unrefined, emotionally volatile, and physically frail. But the foundation is flawless. You are corkless, Nighteye stated. It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement of fact. Izuku nodded miserably, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his uniform, nearly dropping his umbrella. Yes. I know. I know I can't be a hero. Everyone tells me. I know I'm useless. Stop talking, Nighteye interrupted. His voice was not harsh, but it commanded absolute obedience. Izuku froze, a hiccup escaping his throat. Nighteye reached out. He didn't hand the blue notebook back. Instead, he gripped it firmly in his gloved hand. Society is blinded by spectacle, Nighteye said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant cadence that demanded Izuku's full attention. They equate heroism with the capacity for destruction. They look at men who can summon fire or shatter concrete, and they call them gods. But power without direction is merely a disaster waiting to happen. Nighteye stepped closer. He was now close enough that Izuku could see the tiny, golden flecks in his yellow irises. A quirk is merely a tool, Midoriya. It is a biological instrument. Nothing more. Nighteye raised his hand, pointing a long, gloved finger directly at Izuku's forehead. Your mind is a weapon, a highly calibrated, devastatingly precise weapon. And unlike a quirk, your mind cannot be erased, it cannot be countered, and it cannot be exhausted if trained properly. Izuku's breath caught in his throat. His eyes widened, the tears halting entirely. His heart began to beat a frantic, rhythmic drumline in his ears. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had waited his entire life for someone, anyone, to tell him he wasn't broken. You look at the world and you see the underlying architecture of combat, Nighteye continued, his voice intensifying. You predict outcomes. You dismantle flaws. You do, through sheer deductive reasoning, what takes others years of physical conditioning and quirk mastery to achieve. You have artificially synthesized the power of precognition through logic. Nighteye lowered his hand. He looked down at the trembling, rain-soaked boy before him. To leave a mind like yours to rot in the mundane sector would be a tragic waste of potential, Nighteye declared. He extended the blue notebook, finally offering it back to Izuku. I do not care that you lack a quirk, Izuku Midoriya. I can use someone like you. Izuku's hand shook violently as he reached out and took the notebook. His fingers brushed against Nighteye's glove. The leather was dry and warm. Use me? Izuku whispered, his voice trembling under the weight of the moment. But, what can I do? I'm just a kid. For now, yes, Nighteye agreed seamlessly. You are physically inadequate, emotionally fragile, and entirely lacking in practical combat experience. But those are variables that can be corrected. Nighteye adjusted his glasses, the lenses catching the dull gray light of the sky. I am currently in the market for a personal protege. Someone to assist in intelligence gathering, tactical routing, and predictive combat analysis. I will sponsor your entrance into the UA Hero course under the management or general education track, and eventually, the Hero course itself, provided you can survive the regimen I will put you through. Izuku's knees buckled. He dropped the umbrella, the plastic clattering against the concrete. The rain instantly soaked his hair, flattening his green curls against his forehead, but he didn't care. He fell to his knees, clutching the blue notebook to his chest as if it were a holy relic. He let out a loud, ugly, gasping sob. It was a sound of 14 years of repressed agony, isolation, and despair shattering into a million pieces. It was the sound of a boy who had just been pulled from the edge of an abyss. Nighteye looked down at the sobbing boy. Most men would be uncomfortable with such an overt display of emotion. Nighteye merely observed it, analyzing the psychological release. The boy needed this catharsis. He needed to purge the weakness instilled in him by his peers before the real work could begin. Nighteye reached into his coat pocket, retrieved a pristine, folded white handkerchief, and held it out, dropping it gently onto Izuku's head. Dry your tears, Midoriya, Nighteye said, his tone returning to its strict, businesslike baseline. This is the last time you will weep over your own perceived inadequacy. From this moment forward, you are a student of the Nighteye Agency. We do not cry over what we lack. We analyze, we adapt, and we overcome. Izuku grabbed the handkerchief, pressing it to his face. He nodded frantically, gasping for air, his chest heaving. Why yes, sir. I will. I promise. Good, Nighteye said. He turned his back to the rain, looking out over the mountains of trash on Dagoba Beach. His mind was already moving 10 steps ahead. He would need to contact UA. He would need to hire a martial arts instructor, someone brutal, perhaps Eraserhead, if the man could be bought. He would need to contact David Shield regarding specialized support gear. The path ahead was incredibly steep. Creating a quirkless hero was a logistical nightmare that defied every established convention of modern society. But Sir Nighteye smiled, a thin, sharp expression that promised the world a reckoning. He had always enjoyed a challenge. Report to my temporary office in the Central District tomorrow at precisely 1,600 hours, Nighteye commanded, not looking back at the boy. Do not be late, Midoriya. The future waits for no one. I'll be there. Izuku shouted over the sound of the rain, scrambling to his feet. He wiped his face, his green eyes burning with a fiery, unyielding determination that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. Thank you, Sir Nighteye. Thank you? Nighteye began to walk away, his dark coat swallowing the light. Do not thank me yet, boy. By the time I am finished with you, you will wish you had remained invisible. Izuku stood in the rain, watching the hero disappear down the walkway. He held his cheap blue notebook tight against his chest. For the first time in his life, the storm around him didn't feel cold. It felt like a baptism. A quirk is merely a tool. Your mind is a weapon. Izuku Midoriya looked down at the notebook, his mind already racing with 1,000 new theories, 1,000 new possibilities. He wasn't broken. He was just unarmed, and Sir Nighteye was about to show him how to build an arsenal. The digital clock on Izuku Midoriya's phone read 15:57. He stood on the 4th floor of a nondescript commercial building in the Central District of Mizurufu, staring at a frosted glass door. There was no flashy logo, no bold lettering declaring the presence of a hero. The small, brass plaque beside the handle simply read, Any Consulting Temporary Field Office. Izuku's heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had spent the last 24 hours in a state of suspended disbelief. He hadn't slept a wink. He had spent the night staring at his ceiling, replaying the encounter on the rain-swept beach over and over again, terrified that if he closed his eyes, he would wake up to find it had all been a cruel, hyper-realistic dream. I do not care that you lack a quirk, Izuku Midoriya. I can use someone like you. The words echoed in his mind, sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline through his nervous system. He smoothed down the front of his middle school uniform. He had ironed it 3 times that morning. He had polished his red shoes until they gleamed. He needed, to look professional. He was about to step into the world of a pro hero. Not just any hero, but Sir Nighteye. 15:58. Izuku shifted his weight from foot to foot. Should he knock early? It showed eagerness, right? No, Nighteye was a man of absolute precision. Precisely 1,600 hours, he had said. Arriving early might be viewed as an inability to follow explicit instructions. Arriving late was, of course, a death sentence. 15:59. Izuku took a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the slightly stale air of the hallway. He pulled his cheap, replacement blue notebook from his pocket and gripped it tightly in his left hand. It was his anchor. 1,600 hours. Exactly as the minute changed, Izuku raised his fist and knocked on the frosted glass. 3 sharp, measured taps. Enter, a voice called from within. It was crisp, clear, and utterly devoid of warmth. Izuku pushed the door open and stepped inside. He had expected a command center. He had envisioned banks of glowing monitors, holographic maps of the city, and racks of high-tech support gear. Instead, he found himself in a room that looked aggressively mundane. It was an office. A very boring, very neat office. There were filing cabinets lining the walls, a water cooler humming quietly in the corner, and a large mahogany desk situated in the center of the room. The only light came from the large window behind the desk, casting long, stark shadows across the floor. Behind the desk sat Sir Nighteye. He was dressed in another impeccable suit, this one a sharp navy blue with a pale yellow tie. He held a fountain pen in his gloved hand, his eyes scanning a thick stack of printed documents. He didn't look up as Izuku closed the door behind him. You are punctual, Midoriya. A functional baseline, though nothing to be overly praised for. Sit. Nighteye gestured with the pen toward a single, stiff-backed wooden chair positioned in front of his desk. Why yes, Sir Nighteye. Thank you. Izuku practically marched to the chair and sat down perfectly straight, his knees pressed together, his hands resting flat on his thighs. He felt like he was facing a firing squad. Now that he was inside the office, Izuku's hyper-observant eyes couldn't help but dart around the room. It was sparse, but there were details. A subtle dent in the metal of the third filing cabinet, likely caused by a blunt impact. The faint, lingering smell of expensive dark roast coffee and ozone? And then, his eyes caught it. Hanging on the wall to his left, partially obscured by a coat rack, was a framed poster. It was vintage. Mint condition. A limited-run print of All Might's debut in the United States, showcasing the symbol of peace standing atop a ruined bridge, laughing heartily as he held a bus full of civilians over his head. Izuku gasped softly, his inner fanboy instantly overriding his terror. Is that the 1998 California commemorative print? There were only 500 of those ever pressed, the color grating on the crimson of his suit. Midoriya. The words sliced through the air like a scalpel. Izuku's mouth snapped shut. He whipped his head back to face Nighteye. The hero had stopped writing. His yellow eyes were fixed on Izuku, cold and unblinking. We are not here to discuss memorabilia, Nighteye said smoothly, setting his pen down parallel to the edge of his desk. If you are unable to compartmentalize your fanatical obsessions, you may leave through the door you just entered. I apologize, sir. Izuku squeaked, his face burning violently red. He bowed his head so fast his neck cracked. It won't happen again. See that it doesn't. Nighteye leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his long fingers together. He studied Izuku for a long, uncomfortable moment. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. Izuku felt as though he was being dissected under a microscope. Tell me, Midoriya, Nighteye finally broke the silence. Why do you want to be a hero? The question was simple, but it felt like a trap. Izuku swallowed hard. This was it. The interview. He needed to give the right answer. Because I want to save people, Izuku said, his voice starting off shaky but gaining a fraction of confidence as he spoke the truth he had held onto his entire life. I want to be a hero who saves everyone with a smile on his face. Like All Might. I want people to look at me and know that everything is going to be okay. I want to be a symbol of hope. Izuku waited for the nod of approval. It was the quintessential hero answer. It was the absolute truth. Nighteye stared at him. His expression did not change. He slowly unsteepled his fingers and let out a long, quiet sigh that sounded suspiciously like disappointment. A smile, Nighteye repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. You wish to be a symbol of hope? Yes, sir. Midoriya, you are 14 years old. I will forgive your naivete for today. But if you are to be my student, we are going to burn that delusion out of your mind right now. Izuku blinked, taken aback. The delusion? Nighteye leaned forward, the shadows of the room seeming to lengthen around him. All Might is an anomaly. He is a genetic and charismatic miracle. He is a pillar that holds up the entire superhuman society. But tell me, Midoriya, what happens to a building when the single, central pillar begins to crack? Izuku's analytical mind whirred to life instinctively. The structural integrity fails. The weight distribution becomes uneven. The building collapses. Exactly, Nighteye said softly. The symbol of peace is a brilliant concept, but it is fundamentally flawed. It relies on the absolute perfection of a single human being. And human beings are not perfect. They get tired. They get injured. They grow old. Nighteye stood up, walking around his desk to stand directly in front of Izuku. He towered over the boy. You want to save people with a smile. It is a noble, childish sentiment. But tell me, how do you smile at a complex cyberterrorism cell that operates out of 6 different countries? How do you punch a human trafficking ring that communicates exclusively through encrypted dark web ledgers? How does a smile stop a biological weapon from being released in a subway terminal before the villain even steps foot in the city? Izuku was silent. The questions battered against his worldview, tearing down the colorful, comic book pages he had built his dreams upon. The public sees the flashy battles. They see the property damage, the triumphant poses, and the rescue operations on the evening news. Nighteye continued, his voice cold, rhythmic, and relentless. That is daytime heroism. It is necessary for public morale. But it is entirely reactionary. By the time All Might throws a punch, the disaster has already happened. The villain has already struck. People have already been terrified. Nighteye reached out and tapped a thick manila folder resting on his desk. Real heroism, the kind that keeps society functioning, happens in the shadows. It is preventative. It is the intelligence gathering, the surveillance, the predictive routing of criminal networks. It is finding the bomb before the timer is ever set. It is silent. It is grueling. And it is completely devoid of applause. Nighteye looked down into Izuku's wide, trembling green eyes. You are quirkless. You will never be All Might. You will never stand in the center of a crater, laughing while holding up a collapsed bridge. If you try to be that kind of hero, you will die, quickly and pointlessly. The words were brutal. They hit Izuku like physical blows. A part of him, the little boy who had watched the debut video 1,000 times, wanted to cover his ears and run away. But another part of him, the part that wrote obsessively in notebooks, the part that calculated thermodynamics in the rain, knew that Sir Nighteye was absolutely, unarguably right. If I can't be that, Izuku whispered, his voice cracking, then what can I be? You can be the shadow that ensures the pillar never has to bear the weight alone, Nighteye answered instantly. You have a mind that natively processes predictive combat algorithms and tactical psychology. You do not need to punch the villain if you can orchestrate his defeat before he realizes he is in a fight. You will not be the sun, Midoriya. You will be the architect of the eclipse. Nighteye walked back around his desk and sat down. The intense pressure in the room dissipated slightly, replaced by a clinical, academic atmosphere. Now, Nighteye said, tapping a key on his laptop. A large, flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall behind him hummed to life. Let us see if your performance on the street was a fluke, or if there is actually something in that head of yours worth my time. Izuku straightened his back, gripping his notebook so tightly his knuckles ached. He pulled his pen from his pocket, clicking it open. He was terrified, but a strange, foreign feeling was beginning to bloom in his chest. It wasn't the warm, fuzzy feeling of hope. It was the sharp, icy thrill of intellectual validation. Watch the screen, Nighteye commanded. A video began to play. It was low quality, likely security camera footage from a bank lobby. The timestamp in the corner indicated it was from 3 years ago. The footage showed a chaotic scene, hostages cowering on the floor, a bank vault blown wide open, and 3 villains standing near the entrance. One villain had hardened, rock-like skin, another had elongated, blade-like fingers. The third, the apparent leader, wore a sleek suit and was holding a hostage at gunpoint. A pro-hero, Izuku immediately recognized him as Death Arms, burst through the front doors. Pause, Nighteye said. The video froze exactly 1.5 seconds after Death Arms entered the frame. Nighteye turned his chair slightly to face Izuku. You have seen this footage before? And no, sir, Izuku answered truthfully. I know the incident, the 2011 First National Bank siege. But the interior security footage was heavily redacted by the police to protect the identities of the hostages. Correct, Nighteye nodded. You have exactly 30 seconds to assess the frozen frame. Tell me the sequence of events that will occur in the next 5 seconds of this conflict. Do not guess. Deduce. Izuku stared at the screen. His anxiety vanished, immediately swallowed by the absolute focus of his analytical mind. His eyes darted across the frozen pixels, his brain processing dozens of variables a second. 30 seconds. Death Arms relies on overwhelming physical force and intimidation, Izuku muttered, his pen hovering over his notebook, though he didn't write. His posture is completely squared up to the door. He's putting his center of mass forward, preparing for a linear bull rush. Standard intimidation tactic. But, Izuku squinted, leaning forward in his chair. The villain with the blade fingers. His weight is shifted entirely to his back right leg. His left shoulder is dipped. He's not preparing to attack Death Arms, he's preparing to evade to the left. Izuku's eyes flick to the leader holding the hostage. The leader's gun is aimed at Death Arms, but his eyes, his retinas are angled slightly downward and to the right, toward the rock-skinned villain. He's not looking at his target. He's looking at his partner. 15 seconds. The rock-skinned villain is standing over a ruptured water main from the blown vault. Izuku continued, his speech accelerating into a rapid-fire mutter. His fists are clenched, but there's a slight blurring around his boots in the freeze frame. He's vibrating. If his quirk is standard mineral accumulation or hardening, he might need to anchor himself to withstand the kinetic shock of a punch. But he's standing in water. Time. Well? Nighteye prompted, his voice sharp. Izuku didn't hesitate. Death Arms is going to charge the leader. He assumes the gun is the primary threat. But the leader isn't going to shoot. He's going to use the hostage as a biological shield and drop to the floor. The blade villain is a distraction, designed to draw Death Arms' peripheral vision to the left as he evades. The real trap is the rock villain. He's not a close-quarters brawler. He's vibrating because he's a seismic generator. He's going to slam his hands into the waterlogged floor, using the liquid to amplify a shockwave, directly into Death Arms' linear path, knocking him off balance, and collapsing the ceiling above the entrance. Silence filled the office. Nighteye stared at Izuku. His face was a mask of utter indifference. Slowly, he reached out and tapped the spacebar on his laptop. The video resumed. Death Arms roared and charged the leader. The leader instantly dropped to his knees, pulling the hostage down with him. The blade villain leaped wildly to the left, drawing Death Arms' eyeline for a fraction of a second. In that exact moment, the rock villain slammed both fists into the flooded marble floor. A massive shockwave rippled through the water, shattering the floorboards and hitting Death Arms square in the chest. The hero stumbled backward, losing his footing just as the weakened ceiling above the door frame collapsed in a shower of plaster and rebar, burying him. The villains turned and fled through a side exit. Nighteye paused the video again. Izuku sat perfectly still, his heart thumping in his throat. He had been right. It was exactly as he had seen it in his head. But the lack of reaction from Nighteye was terrifying. Had he spoken out of turn? Had he been too arrogant? A competent analysis, Nighteye said smoothly, closing the laptop. Your observation of the leader's eyeline and the blade villain's weight distribution was acceptable. Izuku let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Acceptable. From Sir Nighteye, that was essentially a standing ovation. However, Nighteye continued, his tone hardening, you were slow. You relied heavily on your prior knowledge of Death Arms' public persona to predict his opening move, rather than reading his immediate kinesthetics. You assumed he would charge because he is a brawler. If he had chosen to throw debris instead, your entire predictive model would have collapsed. Izuku flinched. The criticism was razor-sharp, cutting directly to the flaw in his logic. He had relied on bias, not pure observation. This is the science of kinesics, Midoriya, Nighteye said, standing up and moving to the center of the room. The study of body movement, micro-expressions, and nonverbal communication. It is the core of how I simulate foresight in situations where I cannot actively use my quirk. Nighteye took off his suit jacket, draping it neatly over the back of his chair. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing muscular, scarred forearms. People lie. Their words lie. Their quirks are often deceptive. But the human body is bound by the laws of physics and biology. Before a muscle can contract to throw a punch, the brain must send a signal. The breathing pattern changes. The heart rate spikes. The pupil dilates. The center of gravity shifts to accommodate the kinetic chain of the incoming action. Nighteye reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a heavy, metallic object. It was one of his signature hyperdense support items, a customized office stamp weighing over 5 kilograms. He tossed it lightly in his hand. If you wish to be my student, you must learn to read the world in data, not in narrative, Nighteye commanded. Stand up. Izuku scrambled to his feet, dropping his notebook onto the chair. He felt incredibly small standing across from the towering hero. You rely on static observation, Nighteye said, his eyes narrowing slightly. You need time to process. In the field, you will not have 30 seconds to freeze frame a villain. You will have milliseconds. You must learn to read the kinetic chain in real time. Nighteye raised his hand holding the heavy stamp. I am going to throw this at the wall behind you. It will ricochet. I want you to dodge it. Izuku's eyes widened in horror. Sir? That thing looks incredibly heavy. If it hits me, if it hits you, it will shatter your collarbone, Nighteye stated matter-of-factly. Therefore, I suggest you do not let it hit you. Do not look at the stamp, Midoriya. Look at me. Read my body. Before Izuku could even process the instruction, Nighteye's arm snapped forward with blinding speed. Izuku squeaked in terror, throwing his arms over his head and ducking blindly. A heavy rush of wind clipped his ear, followed by a deafening crack as the 5-kilogram stamp struck the plaster wall behind him, denting it severely before clattering to the floor. Pathetic, Nighteye spat. You closed your eyes. You surrendered your sensory input to fear. If I were a villain, you would be dead. Izuku stood up, his knees shaking so violently he thought he might collapse. The air in the room felt suffocating. He was failing. He was blowing his only chance. Nighteye walked over, picked up the stamp, and returned to his starting position. Again. Do not look at the projectile. Look at my shoulder. Look at my hips. Where is the kinetic energy originating? Izuku forced himself to take a deep breath. He wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers. Focus, he screamed at himself. Don't be a fanboy. Don't be a victim. Be an analyst. He locked his eyes onto Nighteye's torso. Ready? Nighteye asked. Izuku didn't answer. He just watched. He saw Nighteye's right foot pivot backward, just a fraction of an inch. The heel lifted. The energy transferred up the calf, tightening the thigh muscle. The hips snapped to the left. He's throwing sidearm. Aiming low. Izuku jumped backward, pulling his knees up to his chest just as Nighteye's arm whipped forward in a low arc. The heavy stamp blurred through the space where Izuku's shins had been a millisecond before, slamming into a filing cabinet with a loud, metallic clang. Izuku landed awkwardly on his backside, gasping for air. He had dodged it. He hadn't just reacted, he had anticipated it. Nighteye retrieved the stamp once more. His face remained an impassive mask, but there was a dangerous glint in his yellow eyes. You guessed, Nighteye said coldly. You saw the hip rotation and you gambled on a low trajectory. A gamble is not a prediction. A gamble is a prayer. I do not teach my students to pray. He raised the stamp again. Again. Stop guessing. Calculate. For the next hour, the small office transformed into a psychological torture chamber. Nighteye threw the heavy stamp relentlessly. He threw it high, he threw it low, he bounced it off the ceiling, he ricocheted off the floor, and Izuku suffered. He was hit 3 times. Once on the shoulder, sending him spinning to the floor in agonizing pain. Once on the thigh, leaving a massive, instant purple bruise that made standing nearly impossible. And once, a glancing blow off his ribs that knocked the wind out of him entirely. Every time he fell, Nighteye stood over him, a dark monolith of disappointment. You are looking at my eyes. The eyes are deceptive. Look at the clavicle. Clang. You are shifting your weight before I have committed to the throw. You are telegraphing your fear. Crash. You are thinking about the pain of the impact instead of the mechanics of the evasion. Stop feeling. Start analyzing. Izuku lay on the floor, gasping for air, clutching his bruised ribs. He was covered in sweat, his neatly ironed uniform ruined, his body aching in a way he had never experienced. He wanted to cry. The familiar, burning sensation of tears pricked at the corners of his eyes. Bakugo was right. He was weak. He was just a quirkless Deku playing dress-up in a world of giants. Get up, Midoriya, Nighteye commanded, his voice echoing in the small room. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut. I can't. I don't know what you want me to do. I want you to use the weapon in your skull. Nighteye snapped, his voice finally losing its calm, clinical edge, replaced by a booming, authoritative roar. I did not select you because you are durable. I selected you because you are a genius. Now act like one. Stop acting like a victim and read the data. Izuku's eyes snapped open. Genius! Sir Nighteye, one of the smartest men in the world, had just called him a genius. Not useless. Not Deku. Not a burden. A genius. The pain in his ribs faded into the background. The fear of failure evaporated, burned away by the white-hot intensity of Nighteye's demand. Izuku didn't just want to prove Nighteye right. He needed to. Izuku pushed himself up off the floor. His left leg trembled from the thigh bruise, but he locked his knee, forcing himself to stand tall. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a bruised forearm. He didn't look at Nighteye's face. He didn't look at the heavy stamp in his hand. He widened his field of vision, blurring his focus slightly to take in Nighteye's entire form simultaneously. Stop feeling. Start analyzing. Izuku let his mind go blank, surrendering entirely to the hyper-analytical state he usually reserved for his notebooks. He mapped Nighteye's body as a wireframe of levers, pulleys, and pivot points. Nighteye's right shoulder dropped. A micro-expression. Fake out, Izuku's brain calculated instantly. The deltoid is relaxed. There's no tension. The real energy is building in the left oblique. Nighteye shifted the stamp to his left hand with terrifying speed and whipped it forward in a high, diagonal arc aimed directly at Izuku's head. Izuku didn't dive. He didn't panic. He saw the exact trajectory mapped out in the air in front of him. He saw the angle of Nighteye's wrist. He calculated the velocity. Izuku merely tilted his head 2 inches to the left. The 5-kilogram stamp roared past his ear, missing his skin by millimeters, ruffling his green hair before smashing violently into the frosted glass of the office door behind him, spiderwebbing the pane with a deafening crash. Izuku stood perfectly still. He didn't blink. He kept his eyes locked on Nighteye's center of mass, waiting for the next kinetic shift. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Izuku's ragged breathing. Nighteye stood frozen, his left arm still extended from the throw. For a long, drawn-out moment, he simply stared at the 14-year-old boy. The boy was bruised, battered, and practically vibrating with adrenaline, but his green eyes were entirely different. They were cold, calculating, and stripped of all fanba naivete. They were the eyes of a tactician. Slowly, Nighteye lowered his arm. He adjusted his glasses, pushing them up the bridge of his nose. The microscopic twitch at the corner of Nighteye's mouth returned. This time, it was a definite, undeniable smirk. Adequate, Nighteye said softly. Izuku's knees finally gave out. He collapsed back into the wooden chair, his body entirely spent, a manic, breathless laugh escaping his lips. He had done it. He had read Sir Nighteye. Nighteye walked over to his desk, rolled down his sleeves, and calmly put his suit jacket back on, adjusting his yellow tie until it was perfectly centered. The torture session was over. The interview had concluded. You possess a grotesque lack of physical conditioning, Nighteye stated, returning to his chair and opening a desk drawer. Your pain tolerance is laughable, your reflexes are delayed by your own neuroses, and your posture is atrocious. Izuku flinched at each critique, his euphoric high crashing rapidly. However, Nighteye continued, pulling out a thick, leather-bound binder and dropping it onto the desk with a heavy thud. Your cognitive processing speed is exceptional. You assimilated a fundamental concept of kinesics and successfully applied it under extreme physical duress in less than 60 minutes. You stopped guessing. You calculated. Nighteye rested his hands on the binder, looking at Izuku with a seriousness that made the boy sit up straight despite his bruised ribs. I am a man of the future, Midoriya. I look at what is, and I plot the course to what will be. 10 months from now, the UA entrance exam will commence. As you are now, you would not survive the first 3 minutes of a combat simulation. Nighteye opened the binder. It was filled with dense, meticulously scheduled spreadsheets, dietary plans, and academic syllabi. This is your life for the next 10 months, Nighteye declared. You will come to this agency, or our main branch in Tokyo when I return there, every day after your mundane schooling. You will be trained in close-quarters evasion, judo, and the deployment of capture weaponry. You will be tutored in criminal psychology, digital espionage, and support gear engineering. You will endure a physical conditioning regimen that will make you long for the bruises you received today. Izuku stared at the binder. It was a manual for reconstructing a human being from the ground up. I will break every naive, hero-worshipping delusion you possess, Nighteye promised, his voice low and intense. I will strip away your reliance on flashy ideals and replace them with cold, calculated pragmatism. I will not make you strong, Midoriya. I will make you dangerous. Nighteye slid a single sheet of paper across the desk, along with his fountain pen. It was a non-disclosure agreement, heavily legally binding, alongside a formal sponsorship contract for the Nighteye agency. You will be my shadow, Midoriya. You will learn to see the world before it happens. If you accept this, you leave Izuku Midoriya the Fanba at that door. You become an operative of this agency. Nighteye leaned back, his piercing yellow eyes boring into Izuku's soul. The choice is yours. Sign the paper, or take your notebooks and go back to playing pretend. Izuku looked at the contract. His hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was the thrill of purpose. He thought of Bakugo's mocking laughter. He thought of his mother's pitying tears. He thought of the All Might poster on the wall, the smiling symbol of a heroism he could never achieve. He didn't need to be the sun. The sun blinded people. The sun cast shadows. And in the shadows, you could see everything. Izuku reached out, picked up the fountain pen, and uncapped it. He didn't hesitate. He didn't second guess. He pressed the nib to the paper and signed his name in sharp, decisive strokes. Izuku Midoriya. He capped the pen and slid the paper back across the desk. Nighteye looked at the signature, then up at the boy. The transformation had already begun. Welcome to the Nighteye agency, Midoriya, Nighteye said, closing the binder. Your training begins tomorrow at 0500 hours. Do not be late. I won't be, sir, Izuku said, standing up. He winced as his bruised thigh protested, but he ignored it. He picked up his cheap blue notebook, clutching it tightly. He bowed perfectly, 90 degrees, without a hint of his previous frantic clumsiness. As Izuku walked toward the shattered frosted glass door, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. Sir Nighteye? What is it, Midoriya? Izuku looked at the vintage All Might poster on the wall, then back at his new mentor. The California commemorative print, Izuku said, his voice quiet but steady. It's a beautiful piece of history, but the color grading on the crimson is slightly faded due to UV exposure from the window behind your desk. You should really invest in anti-glare, UV-resistant framing glass if you want to preserve the asset. Sir Nighteye blinked. For the first time in perhaps a decade, he was genuinely caught off guard. He looked at the poster, then at the window, and back to the 14-year-old boy. A sharp, barking laugh suddenly escaped Nighteye's lips. It was a startling sound, completely out of character for the stoic man. Noted, Midoriya, Nighteye said, a genuine, albeit terrifying, smile gracing his features. Get out of my office. I will see you at dawn. Izuku smiled back, a small, confident smirk that felt entirely foreign on his face. He pushed open the ruined door and stepped out into the hallway, leaving his childhood behind, and stepping firmly into the shadows. Pain was no longer an event, it was an environment. It was the oxygen Izuku Midoriya breathed, the gravity that pulled at his limbs, and the harsh, blinding light that woke him every morning at precisely 4:30. 3 months had passed since the rainy afternoon on Dagoba Municipal Beach when Sir Nighteye had claimed him. 3 months since Izuku had signed his life, his body, and his mind over to the most demanding, mathematically precise hero in Japan. In that time, the frail, trembling boy who flinched at loud noises had not vanished entirely, but he had been systematically broken down and reconstructed, layer by agonizing layer. A quirkless body is a liability only if it moves like one. Nighteye had told him on their first morning, standing over Izuku as the boy violently expelled his meager breakfast onto the sand after a grueling 5-kilometer sprint. You cannot outpunch a man who can turn his skin to steel. You cannot outrun a woman who manipulates kinetic energy. Therefore, you will not try. You will outposition them. The training was not merely physical. It was a torturous synchronization of mind and muscle. Izuku's mornings began at the sprawling, rusted expanse of the municipal beach. But unlike the reckless, brute force clearing methods Izuku had once theorized in his notebooks, Nighteye turned the trash heap into a physics laboratory. Izuku wasn't told to just move a refrigerator. He was told to calculate its center of gravity, assess the structural integrity of the rusted metal, determine the exact angle of leverage required, and use a steel pipe as a fulcrum to shift the object with minimal caloric expenditure. If he used brute force and strained his back, Nighteye would add a kilometer to his morning run. Muscles fatigue. Physics does not. Work smarter, Midoriya, or you will die tired. By 7 o'clock, he was at school. Aldera Junior High had become a bizarre, surreal experience. Bakugo still sneered, the teachers still ignored him, and the oppressive atmosphere remained, but Izuku found himself entirely detached from it. He no longer shrank into his desk. He sat straight, his posture rigidly aligned, a habit beaten into him by Nighteye's heavy stamps. When Bakugo slammed his hands on Izuku's desk, letting off miniature explosions, Izuku no longer saw a terrifying bully. He saw a kinetic chain. He saw Bakugo's right shoulder dip. He saw the weight shift to the left heel. He saw the microscopic flare of the nostrils as oxygen was drawn in to fuel the nitroglycerin sweat. He's off balance, Izuku would think clinically, staring blankly at his childhood tormentor. If I kick the inside of his left knee right now, his center of gravity will collapse, and he will fracture his radial bone trying to break his fall. He never did it, of course. But the knowledge that he could, the absolute, mathematical certainty that he had dismantled his abuser in his mind, was a shield stronger than any quirk. Bakugo, unnerved by the dead, calculating stare of the boy he used to break for fun, had slowly stopped initiating physical contact, opting instead for loud, distant insults that Izuku categorized as auditory white noise. At 15:30, school ended, and the real day began. Izuku would take the train to Nighteye's temporary field office in Mizurufu, where the physical conditioning shifted into combat pragmatism. Today, the air in the rented dojo below Nighteye's office was stiflingly hot, smelling of sweat, tatami mats, and bitter tea. Izuku stood in the center of the mat, wearing a plain white judogi. He was panting heavily, sweat stinging his eyes, his muscles trembling from exhaustion. Across from him stood a towering, broad-shouldered man with a scar running through his eyebrow. This was Takeshi, a retired underground pro hero known as Grapple, whom Nighteye had hired specifically to teach Izuku the brutal, unglamorous art of judo and submission wrestling. Again, kid, Takeshi grunted, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet. You're telegraphing the hip toss. Your eyes darted to my lapel before your hands even moved. From the edge of the mat, sitting in a folding chair with a stopwatch in hand, Nighteye observed. He is correct, Midoriya. You are separating the analysis from the action. You must integrate them. Do not look where you are going to grip. Feel the spatial geometry. Izuku wiped his brow with his sleeve, nodding sharply. He fell into his stance, keeping his knees bent, lowering his center of gravity. He couldn't overpower Takeshi. The man weighed 90 kilograms of pure muscle. Izuku weighed a fraction of that. But judo was the art of yielding. It was the physical manifestation of Izuku's mental processing, taking an opponent's energy and redirecting it into the ground. Takeshi lunged forward, his massive hands reaching for Izuku's collar. Time seemed to slow as Izuku's hyperanalytical mind engaged. His weight is entirely on his front foot. He's committing 80% of his forward momentum into the grab. He expects me to resist or step back. Izuku didn't step back. He stepped in. Instead of fighting the massive hero's momentum, Izuku dropped to one knee, sliding under the man's reach. He grabbed the fabric of Takeshi's sleeve, planted his right foot firmly against the inside of Takeshi's left ankle, and pulled downward while simultaneously twisting his torso. He essentially became a human tripwire. Takeshi's eyes widened in surprise as his own forward momentum, suddenly completely unresisted and lacking its anchor point, carried him over Izuku's shoulder. The massive man slammed onto the tatami mat with a thunderous crack that rattled the windows. Izuku didn't stop. Before Takeshi could recover, Izuku scrambled over the man's chest, securing a tight cross-collar choke, using his own body weight to pin the man's arm. Time, Nighteye called out, clicking the stopwatch. Izuku instantly released the grip, rolling off the larger man and gasping for air. He scrambled to his feet and bowed respectfully. Takeshi sat up, rubbing the back of his neck with a massive hand, a grin breaking across his scarred face. Damn, kid! That was clean. You didn't even use your arms to throw me, you just ruined my geometry. I calculated your velocity and realized that attempting a traditional hip throw would result in my own spine compressing, Izuku panted, his hands on his knees. The sacrifice throw was the only mechanically sound option. Adequate, Nighteye said, standing up from his chair. To anyone else, the words sounded dismissive. To Izuku, it was high praise. Nighteye walked onto the mat, carrying a small, heavy-looking metallic briefcase. Takashi bowed to his employer and quietly exited the dojo, leaving the two of them alone. Your understanding of leverage is progressing, Nighteye noted, setting the briefcase down on the mat. However, judo requires physical contact. In the field, closing the distance with a villain whose quirk involves thermal radiation, acid generation, or biological toxins is a death sentence. You cannot grapple a man made of fire. Izuku straightened up, his eyes locking onto the briefcase. So I need a way to control their center of gravity from outside their operational range. Precisely. Nighteye clicked the latches of the briefcase. Eraserhead utilizes a specialized capturing weapon woven from carbon fiber and a proprietary metal alloy. It is highly effective, but it requires years of conditioning to manipulate purely through centrifugal force and kinesthetic awareness. We do not have years. We have 7 months until the UA entrance exam. Nighteye opened the case. Inside, resting on dark foam, was a spool of what looked like flat, charcoal gray fabric ribbon, about 2 inches wide. At each end of the 50-foot spool, there was a small, dense, teardrop-shaped metallic weight. This is a polyweave tactical capture tape, Nighteye explained, lifting the spool. It is woven from a synthetic aramid polymer, heavily resistant to tearing, cutting, and extreme temperatures. It is not as fluid as Eraserhead's binding cloth, but it serves a different purpose. It operates on the principles of a bola and a weighted whip. He tossed the spool to Izuku. Izuku caught it, nearly dropping it in surprise. It was incredibly heavy for a piece of fabric, weighing at least 8 kilograms. The weights at the ends are composed of a high-density tungsten alloy, Nighteye continued. By utilizing centrifugal force, you can deploy the tape to wrap around limbs, weapons, or environmental anchors. Once the tape wraps around a target, the weighted end will spin exponentially faster as the radius decreases, effectively locking the target in a hyper-tight bind. Izuku stared at the weapon in awe, running his thumb over the rough, durable texture of the tape. It's mathematically perfect. If I calculate the rotational velocity and angle of release, I can essentially create a remote grappling point. I could trip a villain from 20 feet away, or bind their wrists before they can activate a hand-based quirk. That is the theory, Nighteye said coldly. The reality will involve you giving yourself a concussion while learning to wield it. You will dedicate 2 hours every evening to target practice. I expect you to be able to disarm a hostile target at 15 meters by the end of the month. Izuku bowed deeply. Yes, Sir Nighteye. Go clean yourself up, Midoriya, Nighteye instructed, turning his back to the boy. Pack a weekend bag. Tonight, we take the Shinkansen to Tokyo. I have business at the main agency branch, and it is time you saw the standard of excellence you are expected to uphold. Furthermore, there is someone you need to meet. Izuku blinked, pausing as he picked up his towel. Someone I need to meet? Yes, Nighteye said, his voice taking on a strange, unreadable tone. A tone Izuku rarely heard, something akin to reverence, mixed with a heavy, burdensome expectation. A third-year student from UA, my primary protégé. Izuku's heart skipped a beat. A primary protégé? Someone who had survived Nighteye's training? Someone who met this impossible man's standards? Izuku's fanboy instincts flared, his mind racing through the roster of top-tier UA students, wondering what kind of tactical genius, what kind of dark, calculating shadow operative Nighteye had molded before him. I won't let you down, sir, Izuku promised, clutching the heavy capture tape to his chest. The Nighteye Agency main branch in Tokyo was a marvel of modern, minimalist architecture. It was a towering spear of glass and steel, imposing and utterly professional. It lacked the garish colors and flashy statues of other pro-hero agencies. It looked like the headquarters of a high-end corporate intelligence firm, which, in many ways, it was. Izuku walked through the pristine, white marble lobby on Saturday morning, carrying a clipboard filled with analytical data Nighteye had assigned him to organize. He wore a crisp white button-down shirt and black slacks, his green hair neatly combed, though a few rebellious curls stubbornly defied gravity. He looked entirely out of place among the imposing, suited sidekicks moving with practiced efficiency around him, yet he walked with a quiet, focused intensity. Nighteye had gone into a meeting with his senior sidekicks, Centipeder and Bubble Girl, leaving Izuku to familiarize himself with the agency's layout. Izuku was currently mentally mapping the structural weak points of the building's lobby, a habit he couldn't turn off, when he heard a sound that completely shattered the agency's stoic atmosphere. It was a laugh. A loud, booming, completely unrestrained laugh. Ha ha! Oh man, I completely overshot the floor. My bad, my bad. Izuku stopped, blinking in confusion. He turned toward the sound, which seemed to be coming from the solid concrete wall near the elevators. Suddenly, a face pushed its way through the solid concrete. Izuku shrieked, dropping his clipboard. The papers scattered across the marble floor. It was a teenager's face, sporting bright blonde hair styled in a distinctive cowlick, and two simple, cartoonish blue eyes. The face grinned broadly. Whoops! Sorry to spook ya, the face said before the rest of the body casually stepped out of the concrete wall as if parting a bead curtain. Izuku stared in absolute, paralyzing horror. The teenager was tall, heavily muscled, and exuded an aura of overwhelming, blinding positivity. That wasn't what horrified Izuku though. What horrified him was the fact that the teenager, having just phased through a wall, had apparently left his clothes behind in the previous room. He was completely naked. Aya! Izuku yelped, slapping his hands over his eyes and spinning around. Clothes! You don't have clothes! Why don't you have clothes? The blonde teenager looked down, entirely unfazed. Oh! Right. The permeability friction variable. Still haven't nailed the timing on keeping my clothes solid while my body phases. Give me a sec. The boy took a step backward, sinking smoothly into the floorboards like a ghost descending into water. 10 seconds later, the door to the adjacent stairwell burst open, and the boy jogged out, this time wearing a pair of dark blue gym shorts and a white t-shirt. Much better. The boy laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. He walked over to Izuku, who was still trembling, and easily scooped up all of Izuku's scattered papers in one smooth motion. Sorry about that. I'm still working out the kinks in my quirk. I'm Togata Mirio. Mirio held out his hand, a massive, callous palm attached to an arm that looked like it belonged to a Greek statue. He was smiling so brightly Izuku felt like he needed sunglasses. Izuku lowered his hands from his eyes, his analytical brain immediately attempting to process the chaotic entity before him. Togata Mirio. Permeation quirk. Phasing through solid matter. Requires shedding clothes unless equipped with specialized, DNA-woven support gear. The friction of the atoms, the sheer cognitive load required to navigate without solidifying inside a wall. I am Izuku Midoriya, Izuku stammered, hesitantly taking Mirio's massive hand. Mirio's grip was firm, warm, and entirely welcoming. I'm Sir Nighteye's new assistant. Mirio's blue eyes widened in genuine delight. No way! Sir actually took on another student? That's amazing! He's been so grumpy lately, I figured he'd never take another intern. Wow, you look so young! Are you a first year at UA? I'm still in junior high, Izuku admitted, his cheeks burning. I'm just a middle schooler. Whoa! A middle schooler? Mirio leaned in, looking at Izuku with intense curiosity, completely invading his personal space. Sir must have seen something incredibly special in you to bring you here so early. What's your quirk, Midoriya? It must be something super tactical, right? Like X-ray vision or telepathy? The familiar icy spike of shame pierced Izuku's chest. Even here, in the sanctuary of the Nighteye agency, the question followed him. He braced himself for the shift in Mirio's demeanor, waiting for the bright smile to dim into the condescending pity he was so used to. I don't have one, Izuku said quietly, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. I'm quirkless. Mirio blinked. The smile didn't vanish. It didn't even waver. Instead, it somehow grew warmer, shifting from boisterous excitement to profound respect. Quirkless? Mirio repeated softly. He let go of Izuku's hand and placed both of his heavy hands on Izuku's shoulders. Midoriya, do you have any idea how insanely impressive that is? Izuku froze. What? Sir Nighteye doesn't care about flashy powers, Mirio said, his tone entirely sincere. He cares about the mind. If he picked you, a quirkless junior high student, to be his personal student, it means your brain is probably the most terrifying weapon in this entire building. That is so cool. Izuku felt a sudden, overwhelming tightness in his throat. He had expected rejection. He had expected confusion. He had never expected sheer, unfiltered validation from a boy who had literally walked through a wall 3 minutes ago. Why you really think so? Izuku whispered. I know so. Mirio laughed, patting Izuku's shoulders firmly. I had to practically beg Sir to take me on for my work studies, and my quirk is considered one of the most difficult to counter. If you're here, it means we're going to be a great team. Come on, I'll show you the underground training facility. Sir told me to warm up before he gets down there. Before Izuku could protest, Mirio had slung an arm around Izuku's shoulders, steering him toward the elevators like they were old friends. As they walked, Izuku couldn't help but study the blonde teenager. Togata Mirio was everything Izuku was not. He was loud. He was physically imposing. He moved with an effortless, bounding energy that drew the eyes of everyone in the room. He radiated a warmth that made people want to follow him. He was, in every sense of the word, a traditional hero. He was like All Might, but without the untouchable, godlike distance. They reached the sub-basement, a massive, cavernous training facility lined with reinforced concrete, high-tech observation booths, and various simulated terrains. 10 minutes later, the heavy blast doors opened, and Sir Nighteye walked in. He looked exactly the same as he did in Mizurufu, cold, precise, and utterly uncompromising. Togata. Midoriya, Nighteye addressed them, his voice echoing in the large space. I see you have introduced yourselves. Yes, sir. Mirio practically vibrated with energy, standing at attention. Midoriya is awesome. He's got the whole brooding tactician vibe down perfectly. Izuku blushed furiously, adjusting his posture to match Nighteye's strict standards. We shall see, Nighteye said, walking over to an observation console and picking up a tablet. Midoriya. You have spent the last 3 months analyzing kinesics. You have learned to read the kinetic chain of an opponent, predict their movements based on physical telltales, and exploit their leverage. Yes, sir, Izuku answered sharply. Nighteye looked up, his yellow eyes locking onto Izuku. Everything you have learned is useless against Togata Mirio. You cannot grapple a man you cannot touch. You cannot read the kinetic chain of a man who can bypass the laws of physics. Today, you will spar against him. Izuku's jaw dropped. As spar? Against Togata-senpai? He looked at Mirio, whose biceps were roughly the size of Izuku's head. Mirio was a third-year UA student. A prime candidate for pro-hero work. Izuku was a quirkless 14-year-old who had just barely learned how to not trip over his own feet in a judo match. I will be killed, Izuku stated factually. I won't hit you hard, I promise. Mirio beamed, punching his own palm. It'll be fun. A learning experience. You will attempt to survive for exactly 3 minutes, Nighteye instructed, ignoring Izuku's terror. Togata will use his permeation quirk. He will not hold back his speed or his phasing, but he will restrict his striking force to 10%. Midoriya, you are permitted to use your polyweave capture tape and any environmental variables in this room. Nighteye pressed a button on the console. A timer appeared on the massive digital screen on the wall. 3 o'clock. Begin. Mirio didn't hesitate. He dropped into a sprinter stance and kicked off the concrete floor, hurtling toward Izuku at a terrifying speed. Izuku's brain kicked into overdrive. He's fast. Incredibly fast. I need distance. Izuku reached into his pocket, pulling out a handful of the high-friction chalk he used for his capture tape, and threw it forcefully onto the floor between them, creating a massive cloud of white dust. He immediately dove backward, unspooling the heavy gray capture tape from his waist. Mirio charged straight into the dust cloud. If I throw the weighted end into the cloud, I can wrap his legs. Izuku calculated, swinging the heavy tungsten weight in a rapid arc before releasing it into the white smoke. The tape whizzed through the air, completely unimpeded. There was no sound of impact. No resistance. Suddenly, the concrete floor directly beneath Izuku's feet rippled. Izuku looked down in horror just as a massive, smiling face materialized out of the solid stone. "Peek-boo!" Mirio chirped. Before Izuku could even process the visual, a fist materialized out of the floor and tapped him lightly on the stomach. Even at 10% power, the punch felt like being hit by a slow-moving car. All the air was violently expelled from Izuku's lungs. He was launched backward, tumbling across the hard concrete, gasping for breath. "Oh gosh, sorry. Was that too hard?" Mirio asked, popping entirely out of the floor, standing unharmed amidst the settling chalk dust. Izuku rolled onto his side, coughing violently, tears pricking his eyes. "What happened?" "He bypassed the tape, he sank into the floor, but how did he see me?" The dust cloud. Izuku forced himself to his feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in his abdomen. The timer read 2:40. He had survived 20 seconds. He gripped his capture tape, his mind racing. Kinesics was useless. If Mirio wanted to punch, he didn't need to shift his weight. He just phased his arm through the air resistance and solidified on impact. "Think, Midoriya, think," Izuku demanded of himself. Permeation. Phasing through matter. That means his atoms slip past other atoms. If that's true, then light passes through his eyes when he's fully phased. Sound passes through his eardrums. Oxygen passes through his lungs. Izuku's eyes widened as the realization hit him. When he is completely phased, he is blind, deaf, and suffocating. He can only perceive the world when he is solid. "Here I come again!" Mirio shouted, charging forward. Izuku didn't run. He watched Mirio intensely. As Mirio closed the distance, he dropped into the floor again, intending to execute another pop-up attack. "He's blind down there," Izuku calculated. "He has to guess my location based on my last known trajectory. He expects me to retreat." Instead of backing away, Izuku sprinted forward, directly toward the spot Mirio had vanished. He didn't aim for Mirio. He aimed for the environment. Izuku swung the weighted end of his capture tape toward a heavy, freestanding steel weight rack nearby. The tungsten weight wrapped securely around the thick metal pole. Izuku planted his feet, grabbed the tape with both hands, and pulled with all his meager strength. The heavy steel rack tipped over, crashing onto the concrete with a deafening, vibrating clang. A split second later, Mirio's head popped out of the floor, exactly where Izuku had been standing a moment ago. Mirio gasped for air. He had to solidify his lungs to breathe. In that microscopic window, as Mirio opened his eyes to locate his target and solidified his face to take in oxygen, Izuku was already moving. He didn't attack Mirio's body. He knew the older boy would simply phase through it. Izuku kicked the chalk-covered floor violently, sending a wave of fine, irritating white powder directly into Mirio's freshly solidified face. Mirio inhaled sharply, choking on the chalk dust. "Gah! Ack!" He instinctively raised his hands to rub his eyes, solidifying his arms and chest to do so. "Got you!" Izuku didn't hesitate. He snapped his wrist, sending the other weighted end of the capture tape flying through the air. The gray ribbon lashed out, wrapping tightly around Mirio's left ankle, which was currently solid to support his stance. "Whoa!" Mirio yelped as the tungsten weight swung around, locking his leg in a tight bind. Izuku immediately dropped his center of gravity, gripping the center of the tape, and yanked backward with every ounce of leverage he possessed. Mirio, caught entirely off guard, coughing on chalk and momentarily blinded, lost his balance. His heavy frame tipped backward, and he crashed onto the concrete floor with a heavy thud. The timer beeped loudly. Midnight. Silence descended upon the training room. Izuku stood panting, his chest heaving, his hands gripping the tension capture tape. He had done it. He had theoretically subdued a third-year UA powerhouse. Mirio lay on his back for a moment, blinking the chalk out of his eyes. Then, slowly, a massive, genuine smile spread across his face. "Ha ha! Holy cow!" Mirio burst into laughter, sitting up and completely ignoring the tape wrapped around his ankle. "You totally got me. That was incredible." You figured out my sensory deprivation weakness in less than 3 minutes? Izuku let out a long, shaky breath, releasing the tension on the tape. I realized you couldn't breathe or see while phased, so I altered my trajectory, used the sound of the falling rack to mask my footsteps, and forced you to solidify your face to assess the situation. That is so smart. Mirio beamed, phasing his legs slightly to let the tape fall away, then jumping to his feet. He jogged over and slapped Izuku on the back, nearly sending the smaller boy sprawling again. You didn't try to outpunch me, you outthought my quirk. Midoriya, you're a genius, Izuku blushed, rubbing the back of his neck. I just analyzed the variables. That is enough, Nighteye's cold voice cut through the celebration. He walked down from the observation deck, his face impassive, though Izuku, trained to read micro-expressions, saw a faint, distinct gleam of satisfaction in the hero's eyes. You exploited a structural weakness in his quirk mechanics, Midoriya. That is acceptable, Nighteye evaluated. However, had Togata been operating with lethal intent, he would not have surfaced to breathe. He would have simply phased through your internal organs. Do not let a training victory breed arrogance. Yes, sir, Izuku bowed. Nighteye turned to Mirio. Togata, your reliance on predictability is a flaw. You assumed he would retreat because that is what your previous opponents have done. Against a tactical thinker, your habits will kill you. Yes, sir, Nighteye. I'll work on my unpredictability. Mirio saluted, completely undeterred by the criticism. Go shower. Both of you, Nighteye commanded, turning to leave the room. We review the footage in 20 minutes. 30 minutes later, Izuku stood in the locker room, dressed back in his crisp white button-down and black slacks. He was towel-drying his green hair, his mind replaying the sparring match. He had survived. More than that, he had successfully executed a predictive trap against the Hiter quirk user. The validation was intoxicating, but beneath it, a quiet, analytical hum persisted in his brain. He thought about Togata Mirio. Mirio was extraordinary. His quirk was practically invincible, his physique was flawless, and his personality was a beacon of unyielding optimism. He was a natural leader. But Izuku couldn't shake the observation he had made while watching Nighteye interact with Mirio. Nighteye was harsh on both of them, but the type of harshness was different. With Izuku, Nighteye was attempting to forge a weapon, a shadow operative, a tactician. He looked at Izuku like a complex piece of code that needed debugging. But when Nighteye looked at Mirio, he looked at him with an intense, almost desperate reverence. It was the same look Izuku used to give his All Might posters. Nighteye wasn't just training a sidekick in Mirio. He was grooming a successor. But a successor to what? The Nighteye agency didn't require a blindingly positive, frontline powerhouse as its director. The agency operated in the shadows. Mirio belonged in the sunlight. Izuku slung his towel over his shoulder and walked out of the locker room. He found Mirio down the hall, standing in front of a massive floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the sprawling Tokyo skyline. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the city. Mirio was fully dressed in his Yui uniform, looking out at the city with a serene, determined expression. Hey, Midoriya, Mirio said without turning around, hearing Izuku's approaching footsteps. Crazy view, right? Every time I look out here, I think about how many people are out there living their lives. I want to save 1 million of them. That's my goal. The hero le million. Izuku stepped up beside him, looking out at the endless sea of buildings. It's a noble goal, Togata-senpai. Just Mirio is fine, Izuku. Mirio laughed, throwing an arm around Izuku's shoulders again. It felt entirely natural this time. We're going to be working together a lot. I can feel it. Izuku looked up at the older boy. The golden light of the sunset caught Mirio's blonde hair, making him look almost ethereal. He looked like a comic book hero brought to life. Mirio. Izuku started, his analytical mind voicing the question before he could stop it. Why did Sir Nighteye choose you? Mirio blinked, looking down at Izuku in surprise. What do you mean? I mean, the Nighteye agency specializes in intelligence, predictive routing, and underground tactical operations, Izuku elaborated, his voice steady. Your quirk is heavily combative, and your personality is conspicuous. You don't fit the operational profile of this agency. So why did Sir Nighteye personally recruit you? Mirio's smile softened. It didn't disappear, but it became quieter, carrying a weight Izuku hadn't seen before. You really are observant, huh? Mirio murmured. He turned back to the window, resting his hands on his hips. Sir Nighteye. He's looking for something very specific. He believes society needs a certain kind of symbol. Someone who can inspire people just by standing there. He thinks I can be that person. A symbol. Izuku's breath hitched. The pieces rapidly clicked together in his mind. Nighteye's obsession with All Might. The vintage posters. The bitter fallout between the two former partners. The fading of the symbol of peace. Nighteye isn't just grooming a pro-hero. He's grooming the next All Might. He thinks you can replace him, Izuku whispered, the realization sending a shiver down his spine. I don't know about replacing, Mirio said humbly, rubbing his neck. But Sir believes the world is going to need a very bright light soon, and he's doing everything he can to make sure I shine as brightly as possible. A slow, deliberate clapping sound echoed down the hallway. Izuku and Mirio turned. Sir Nighteye was walking toward them, his hands clapping in a slow, rhythmic cadence. He stopped a few feet away, his yellow eyes fixed on Izuku. Your deductive reasoning remains your most formidable asset, Midoriya, Nighteye said smoothly, dropping his hands. You see the board, even when the pieces are hidden. Sir, Mirio stood at attention. Nighteye stepped up to the window, standing between the two boys. He looked out at the setting sun, his expression unreadable. Society is delicate, Nighteye spoke, his voice carrying the weight of a man who carried the world's secrets. It relies on the illusion of absolute safety. All Might provides that illusion, but illusions fade. And when the dark comes, the people will panic unless there is a new light to guide them. He turned his head slightly, looking at Mirio. Togata possesses the charisma, the unwavering spirit, and the absolute selflessness required to be that light. He is not a tactician. He is a force of nature. He is being prepared to carry a burden that would crush an ordinary man. Nighteye then turned entirely, locking his piercing gaze onto Izuku. But a light as bright as Togata will cast a massive shadow. And in that shadow, the vile, the calculating, and the unseen will fester. A symbol cannot be everywhere at once. A symbol cannot interrogate a ledger, or dismantle a cyber-terrorist cell, or predict the movements of an underground syndicate. Nighteye stepped closer to Izuku, looking down at the quirkless 14-year-old. When I found you on that beach, Midoriya, I saw the missing piece of my design. Togata has the heart and the power to save the masses. But he will need someone to ensure he is never ambushed. He will need a mind capable of analyzing the threats he cannot see, and neutralizing them before they ever reach the light. Nighteye raised his hand, resting it firmly on Izuku's shoulder. It was a heavy, demanding weight. He will be the sun, Nighteye declared, his voice echoing with absolute certainty. You will be the shadow that ensures the sun never sets. Izuku stood frozen. He looked at Mirio. The older boy was smiling at him, a look of absolute, unwavering trust in his bright blue eyes. Mirio didn't view Izuku as a sidekick, or a lesser partner. He viewed him as an equal, the shield to his sword. Izuku looked down at his own hands. They were calloused from the capture tape, bruised from judo, and stained with ink from his notebooks. He didn't have superhuman strength. He couldn't phase through walls. He would never stand on a podium and be cheered by millions. He would operate in the dark, bleeding for a world that would never know his name. And for the first time in his life, Izuku Midoriya realized he was perfectly, completely okay with that. The childhood dream of being All Might evaporated, entirely replaced by a cold, burning purpose. He didn't want the applause. He wanted the results. He wanted the intellectual thrill of outsmarting monsters. He wanted to be the architect of victory. Izuku looked up at Sir Nighteye, his green eyes utterly devoid of the trembling fanba he had been 3 months ago. I understand, sir, Izuku said, his voice steady, carrying the chilling calm of a true tactician. I will map the board. I will identify the threats. And I will eliminate them from the dark. Nighteye's lips twitched upward into a proud, dangerous smile. Excellent, Nighteye said softly. Your training wheels are coming off tomorrow, Midoriya. The tactical simulation difficulty will be increased by 400%. Izuku didn't flinch. I'll calculate the variables tonight. Mirio threw his arms around both of them, pulling the strict hero and the stoic middle schooler into a massive, suffocating bear hug. We are going to be the most amazing team ever. Mirio cheered loudly, completely ruining the serious atmosphere. Nighteye let out an annoyed sigh, attempting to extract himself from the teenager's vice-like grip. Togata, unhand me immediately, you are wrinkling my suit. Izuku, squished against Mirio's massive chest, couldn't help but let out a small, genuine laugh. The sun was setting over Tokyo, but as Izuku looked at the chaotic, powerful blonde boy and the cold, calculating hero who had saved him, he knew his real life was just beginning. The shadow had found its purpose, and the world of villains was entirely unprepared for what was coming.